Hello and welcome to Atheists Talk. I'm James Zimmerman. I'm going to be your host for this show. This is actually part 2 of a 2-part show, so if you haven't seen part 1, go back and watch it and then you'll be brought up to speed, but hopefully we'll make a good show for you even if this is the first one you're catching. Our guest for this show is Shawn Otto. Welcome, Shawn.
Thank you.
Shawn is the co-founder of sciencedebate.org, which we will talk about more in this episode. He's also the producer of the U.S. presidential science debates. He's advised science debate efforts in actually several countries. And recently he's authored a book, as you see sitting here on the table, The War on Science: Who's Waging It, Why It Matters, What We Can Do About It. It was recently published in 2016 by Milkweed Editions. So we're going to talk about what he has in that book a little bit more. We did in part 1. So one thing that we want to just pick right up with again is that you talk about in your book the founding of the United States and how that's maybe a model, or that's something that we should try to recapture.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really important, I think, and we talked in part 1 too about the problem in college education, and I often argue, especially when I talk to college administrators or professors, that we need more science civics. So that people really understand the relationship between science and democracy, especially. And a lot of people don't realize that Thomas Jefferson was a scientist as well as an attorney. Mm-hmm. Francis Bacon, who's credited as kind of the founder of the scientific revolution, was the Attorney General of England, but he was also a scientist. And this relationship between science and law and science and public policy goes way back to the beginning of the scientific revolution, but particularly it was important in the founding of the United States. Because Jefferson was looking for an argument to convince other Enlightenment nations to stay out of the Revolutionary War. His life hung in the balance. Yeah. And he was making an argument against authoritarianism, the authoritarianism of the monarchy. And so he looked for the strongest, most powerful Enlightenment arguments that he could find because his life was hanging in the balance on those arguments. And that's one reason, I think, why the Declaration of Independence, as our founding document declaring that we were independent as a nation from England, is so lyrical and so poetic and so powerful. What he did, sitting for 17 days in that hot little rented room near Center City, Philadelphia, is he started thinking about what he called his trinity of 3 greatest men, all of them scientists: Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke. And he synthesized their thinking, and essentially what he came up with was, if anyone can discover the truth of something for him or herself using the tools of science and reason, then no king, no pope, no wealthy lord is more entitled to govern us than we are ourselves. So the idea of democracy, the crowdsourcing of government, the reliance on the invisible hand of the will of the informed people, was really based on the ideas of science and the ideas of discovering the truth through knowledge, through experimentation.
Mm-hmm. So he was rejecting the authoritarianism of royalty, King George specifically in this case, and championing the authoritarianism of science?
The anti-authoritarianism of science. And that's a tension that happens in our politics to this day. Mm-hmm. I often say that science is never partisan, but it's always political. And I say that because a scientist has to be both conservative and progressive, left and right. But there's more to our politics than left and right. The scientist will have to say, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at those traditional values of all the science that has come before on this particular topic, and I'm going to include and account for that in my research if I publish on something. If I don't do that, I could risk career suicide. Mm-hmm. But also, I have to look forward. I have to be on the cutting edge of whatever is new, and I have to go with the evidence. And if I don't do that, I risk a different kind of career suicide through stagnation. So a scientist is both conservative and progressive at the same time. So science is not partisan, but science is political because there's another dimension to our politics that sometimes people don't think about, and that's the vertical dimension between anti-authoritarianism and authoritarianism. And that's what Thomas Jefferson was getting at, was saying that you don't have a right to govern because you are a monarch or because you're a pope. This is the same thing that, for instance, Martin Luther was getting at by saying, look, don't listen to the Pope. Read the Bible yourself. I've translated it for you. I printed it for you. You can look for yourself and see what it says. So it's kind of this tradition of anti-authoritarianism in Western thinking that science ultimately grew out of. And that tension is still there now between religious fundamentalists who want to say, no, I don't care about the knowledge or what you say about evidence or what nature says. I just want to do what's in the book. Versus the more Puritan approach. Ironically, the Puritans were pro-science because they looked at what they called the book of nature to understand God's will and by studying nature. And that's really how a lot of science grew. So there's always this tension on the ideological front, but also on the economic front with authoritarianism and science.
Is it Jonathan Edwards or Cotton Mather's speeches that he gave to his congregation that are very laced with scientific terminology, as if he's trying to win them over to God by convincing them scientifically? But it reminds me of, in the first part of this segment, you talked about that someone can be a liberal conservative, and you said there's no contradiction in that, and then now you were just talking about more a vertical and horizontal scale, more of a quadrant instead of a duality.
Right, and that's with that quadrant, it becomes clear then how someone could be conservative on the right end, but liberal on the top end. Because the liberals are the anti-authoritarians, and because they're about liberal expression of ideas and basing things on evidence versus on assertions. By the same token, you can have authoritarians on both the left and right. Joseph Stalin was a leftist authoritarian, as was Mao Zedong. Terrible time in both Russia and China under those leaders who were strongly anti-scientific. By the same token, you can have authoritarians on the right, like Adolf Hitler, or Mussolini, Hitler adopted science early on, but then his intolerance of diversity of thought wound up driving science out of Germany.
A real brain drain there.
Yeah, and we were actually the beneficiaries of a lot of that during World War II.
So, as you mentioned in part one, Thomas Jefferson was really the apex of a president being science-minded. You even said that President Obama is probably the second or the best one we've had since then, and there's been, 40-some presidents in between those two men. And now we're left with a war on science, to quote your book title. And you say that it's fought on three fronts. So I'll list these out here, and then maybe you can break them apart for us a little bit, okay? You say the identity politics, there's the ideological war, and the industrial war.
Yeah, so the identity politics war really developed in humanities departments of universities, and was really a pushback after World War II. It started in kind of French thinking, French philosophy, because science had come to be associated politically with the military-industrial complex, and the Germans the Nazis had used science to argue for their eugenics program, and the French philosophers really disliked the politics of science. And so they came up with arguments against science itself. And they argued that science was just but one of many possible ways of knowing. And that it's a meta-narrative. Lyotard talked about how he would define postmodernism, post the modern era, which is based on science and rationality, so it's postmodernism. And he would define postmodernism at its most simple terms as suspicion of meta-narratives. And science was one of those meta-narratives. It was a story that the white male elite told just to retain power. So essentially it was portraying science as if it was a PR campaign, and not as if it was based on objectivity. And they developed arguments saying that reality isn't reality because it's out there, because it's something that we see. We call whatever's out there an object because we put it out there with our language, and that it's really our language that structures all of this. And this kind of thinking became really in vogue in humanities departments in universities because they were being deposed by science in terms of their budget and their prestige. And so all of a sudden they could argue, oh, science is just a junior part of the humanities. And it actually flowed well together with the politics of the 60s and the idea of empowering disempowered voices, which was really helpful. Because anytime, even in science, especially in science, the more diverse points of view you have to bring to bear on a problem, the more likely you are to get at the truth. But it wasn't true, it was true for politics, but it wasn't true for objectivity that there's no such thing, or for science that there's no such thing as objectivity. So this development wound up essentially by discrediting objectivity and science. It created a method for authoritarians to argue against science in the public thinking, and a reason for humanities departments and university administrations to stop worrying about having to teach science to everybody. And we've seen the result of that, as a lot of people don't really understand the difference between knowledge and opinion.
So that's the identity politics
Right.
war. And then the next one was the ideological war.
Yeah, so the identity politics work helps inform the ideological war on science, where people, generally on the right, conservative, religious conservatives, fundamentalist evangelicals, have adopted a lot of those arguments to say that, well, actually, we can argue with science.
Right,
You see, for instance, things like, Ken Ham is really, the creationist, is really good at that. And a lot of the whole intelligent design movement, arguing with evolution, uses a lot of those techniques, as do many ideologically motivated arguments with science, the ideas of abstinence-only sex education, or now the opposition to certain kinds of vaccination, like HPV vaccination, because they're afraid that it will encourage promiscuity by removing one of the penalties of having sex, which is cervical cancer. So this ideologically motivated war against what science is saying about, and we touched a little bit on this the last time, about human origins or about sexuality and reproduction, and the attacks on science around that. And finally, the industrial war on science, which is funded by about $1 billion a year, that comes largely from the energy industry, but also from other industries. The tobacco industry creating doubt about the links between smoking and cancer, not so much here anymore, but in other countries around the world. The sugar industry, who starting in the 1960s funded research at Harvard and other institutions to create a false sense that it wasn't sugar that was associated with heart disease, it was fat. Or the energy industry, that climate change isn't happening, which is the big one that we're dealing with right now, or the chemical industry, that DDT and other pesticides weren't dangerous. There's a lot of these kinds of issues where companies that have seen what environmental science, or in some cases biological science, say about their business practices, perceive that as an existential threat, and then they fund AstroTurf groups to create fake grassroots movements, and they hire public relations firms to help develop these. They hire captive scientists that will publish a one paper that contradicts the mainstream, and then they'll point to that one paper and they'll say, no, look, there's a controversy
it's a valid
here.
alternating viewpoint,
right, and because there's a controversy, we should have a debate, because debate is healthy. And ignoring the fact that there's one paper on this side of the debate, quote unquote, versus maybe 10,000 on the other side of the debate. And then they will take advantage of the media's penchant for balance then to say we have to have a balanced conversation. And that winds up eroding the public's perception of the role of science and evidence in public policy making.
Yeah, because you mentioned that what is a strength of science, that they're never 100% sure and that they're always open for things to be changed or refined or modified, gets kind of twisted through these lenses, this ideological and industrial lenses of for this war to suit their purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a lot of people like certainty, and science doesn't trade in certainty. And in fact, if we're to be honest about life, there's no such thing as certainty. All of science is kind of pawing in the dark to figure out what may be true based on what we're feeling around and what seems to be the feedback from nature. And so a scientist using inductive reasoning will say, I've looked at all these swans, and every swan I've ever seen is white, so I can make an inductive statement that all swans, not that all swans are white, but that all swans are probably white. And that's where statistics and math come into science. Because a scientist will say, because we can't see the whole world at once, we won't make an absolute statement saying we're certain about this. We'll say this is a well-supported idea, and that we can say with confidence that all swans are probably white, and here's the math that shows how much confidence we have in that statement. But we'll hold out the possibility, because we can't look at the whole world at once, that there might be a black or a non-white swan somewhere. And that kind of rigorous honesty is really required to be exact in science. But a lot of people aren't comfortable with the uncertainty of that, and they long for certain answers. And that's where they become vulnerable.
So they'll say, because we don't have 100% certainty, we can't act as if it's certain.
Right. Public relations campaigns then will take advantage of that and say, lacking certainty, we should do nothing. Ignoring the fact that we really are not certain about anything. It's just that the scientists are the only ones that are being honest about that fact. And yet the science gives us much more confidence that what that point of view is saying is actually the most credible.
And we really act that way in everyday life. I mean, when I go up to my bedroom tonight in my house, I have no 100% certainty that the stairs are going to hold me, but I'm going to run up the stairs as if they're going to hold my weight, even though there is a tiny chance that, you know, I could crash through the floor and break my back that one time out of a billion that I go up the stairs. You know,
or that a tornado might blow by at that moment and take off the upstairs. But yes, but we proceed based on the evidence of our experience, knowing that there are those chances, but it's our best guidepost. The science of our experience in that case is our best guidepost to guiding us towards the future.
Okay, so I want to spend, we got like 10, 12 minutes left. I wanted to get to some of the ideas you have. The battle plans is what you call them.
Right.
We don't have time to talk about all of them. There's 14 in your book. The one I want to talk about first, it's not the first one you list in your book, but it's the one that you spend the most time talking about, and it's the one that I think you personally have had the most success and put the most investment into, and that is a push for science debates.
Right.
So let's talk about that one first. What exactly do you mean by pushing for science debates?
Yes, okay. So I spoke, I think in the first, or maybe it was before we were on camera.
It
but,
starts to blur.
Yes, my kind of a co-founder, Matthew Chapman, who happens to be Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson, was a film writer, as was I, and we both were noticing that the candidates weren't talking about these big science-driven issues. And when you think about it, that's a problem, because collectively science, technology, engineering, health, and the environment are impacting all voters' lives at least as much as the economic policy or the foreign policy or the faith and values issues that candidates often talk about in the campaign trail. So we said we ought to have a debate that's dedicated to these kinds of issues too, so the public can assess the relative role of evidence in these candidates' thinking, not just what they think about issues like climate change, but the role that they give to evidence versus politics and ideology in their thinking. So we created this organization called sciencedebate.org to push candidates and to provide a forum for that kind of discussion. Now, we haven't been able to get the candidates to agree to a televised debate yet, but this is the third cycle in a row where we have actually gotten the candidates for president to engage and answer these questions online.
And when you say the third cycle, you're talking about 2016. Just saying this for people who might be watching or listening to this
That's right.
months after we record.
We've done it between President Obama and his opponent John McCain in 2008, between Obama and his opponent Romney in 2012, and actually Romney did a little bit better than Obama that time. I think Obama kind of phoned in his answers that time. And then this time, 2016 between Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, and we also invited Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party candidate, and Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate. So we've got all four of them there at sciencedebate.org/20answers is where you can find their answers. And I'd encourage people to check those out because they really do provide an interesting insight into how the ideological perspectives of these different candidates influence their thinking and the way that they, the relative role that they give to evidence in their thought processes.
Yeah, and as we talked about earlier, so often campaigns and televised debates can go off rail and start talking about things that aren't really relevant. Like if someone, I can't even think of it, you know, like I think you mentioned if someone has a pin on their lapel that's upside down or just something silly, you know, if someone was coughing and maybe they're sick, you know, or if someone just doesn't look as good as the other person on the camera, just silly things that really shouldn't make a difference in how we vote.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's good to get actual substance.
Well, not only that, but even if they are talking about economics or foreign policy, they ought to be talking about these issues too, because these are having such a big impact. And not only that, unlike economics and foreign policy, science, engineering, tech, and health and environment, these issues are really accelerating. They're really impacting life more and more and more and more, and we've simply got to find a more robust way of incorporating them in our public policy dialogue in order to be able to continue to govern ourselves. You know, Thomas Jefferson said, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. And that's why he was a big proponent of freedom of the press to inform adults and public education to inform children. So we had intelligent, well-informed citizenry that could continue to govern themselves. But that becomes a problem in an era where science is increasingly complex. So we need to find new mechanisms to incorporate that advanced information and discussion of it in our public dialogue.
And speaking of children, another idea that you have for a battle plan is that teachers should hold science civics. They should hold student science debates and establish scientific literacy requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can get through college in a lot of colleges without taking any science, and the science that is taught often in schools is really about kind of regurgitating the right answer instead of the way that science really functions, where there is no right answer. You're trying to discover what is really true. Plus, students don't have oftentimes any sense of why these things are important in their lives. One of the principles of teaching is that you create cognitive dissonance, and you also create a sense of personal urgency, or why this matters to me. And then students are engaged and interested, and they can take in new information. So one way to do that actually helps our civics process too is to explore the relationship between science and democracy and science and public policy, and what is evidence and how is it that we actually know things, and how is it that we can be fooled by public relations efforts or by advertising and media. So another tool for doing that is to actually hold student science debates. So you pick controversial issues that students may hear about in the news media, like whether we should be teaching creationism in science class. And you have students argue both sides of that issue, but you don't tell them until the day of the debate which side they're going to argue. So they have to research both sides, the evidence-driven side and the ideological-driven side. And they learn then through that process the relative role of evidence versus ideologically driven rhetorical arguments. And they develop tools in critical thinking to tell the difference.
And we're not just talking about university students here, you're also meaning middle school, high school. What age do you think is a good time to start that?
7th grade is great.
Oh, sure, okay. As they become teenagers.
Absolutely. Well, my wife used to be she's the state auditor of Minnesota, but she used to be a science teacher.
Okay.
And one of the things that she did was she taught 7th grade life science. And she had a unit where she would bring out an air fern, which is a fern you can buy in a bag. It's green. It's actually an exoskeleton of a sea creature, and it's spray painted green.
Oh, okay.
But it's sold as a fern, doesn't need water, doesn't need soil, it looks beautiful. You can plant it, you can fluff it, you can stick it anywhere. Is it alive or is it not alive? and without telling really what it is, exploring a unit. And actually, when you start thinking about it, what is life? You can get into all kinds of fascinating discussions,
Sure,
and you
yeah.
can really help kids understand how easily they can be misled. Because is fire alive? It moves, it reproduces, it consumes. Is a virus alive? There's a lot of areas of science where we actually don't have a clear definition of what is life.
Yeah. So even just a simple thing can open up a big discussion for younger students. Another option, another battle plan that you mentioned is to establish a National Center for Science and Self-Governance. I think I have it flagged here on page 381. You mentioned, and we just have a couple minutes left, but you say, too often public policy discussions become sidetracked by special interests into debates over the science itself. But what if the science was settled? Then what would the debate look like? And you even mentioned trying to bring religious groups on board with that too. Where's that?
I do. Well, there's been a lot of research that shows that if you can create a bridging dialogue like that, you can depolarize some of these issues. And that if religious groups or churches or houses of faith, actually, they serve a religious purpose, but they also serve a social purpose, social bonding, social connection, and a chance to morally and ethically reflect on issues in society. And if pastors did a better job of being members of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and staying up on cutting-edge research, they could actually help their parishioners parse some of these complex moral and ethical discussions. They don't have to get into the religious aspects of it necessarily, but they can help help parishioners negotiate this complex time that we're living in, instead of falling back on the same old political divides that we often get into that have kept us polarized. So in any time that you can adopt somebody's value system towards a reasonable discussion, I think it's helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that was a pretty strong argument. This is a good idea for a battle plan. Another one that you have is that granting bodies should require and fund more outreach, help the public understand not just that science is important, but why it's important. We have like 1 minute, but we should have spent more time talking about why scientists need to be more out there.
Yeah. Scientists are, by and large, not really great communicators. They can develop a lot of skill at it, but they also might as well be having a budget in their labs to hire people who are skilled at it, and be doing the public outreach that we need to. It used to be that scientists did a lot of public outreach. Edwin Hubble, a great astronomer, spoke to standing room only crowds of 5,000 people. But with the advent of government-funded science in 1957, scientists really kind of withdrew, and they didn't have to do public outreach anymore.
You mentioned that scientists that do that are kind of looked down upon, such as Carl Sagan from a few decades ago, Bill Nye maybe right now. So that's too bad. We need to get over that. But
we do, absolutely.
Yeah. So our time is up, but again, I thank you. And I encourage anyone who has not read the book yet to get Shawn Otto's book. It's a very fascinating read. It's a quick read despite being 400 plus pages. It really held my interest the whole time. And also make sure that you watch part 1 of our show to learn more about the book itself and about Shawn's excellent work that he's doing. And if you would like to contact us, we'll send you a copy of our newsletter, because if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. So thank you again.